Welcome to the Distinctive Christianity podcast. We have a great honor today to be joined by, I would say, thank you for being here, but thanks for letting us come here, Dr. David J. Garrow, who is the historian, as far as I'm concerned, of King, Martin Luther King Jr. His Pulitzer Prize winning biography, Bearing the Cross, is what we're going to be discussing today, as well as other articles around the biography and a recent article as well. All of these resources will be in the show notes. Dr. Garrow, thank you so much.
Certainly.
Let's go all the way back. What led you to write such a book of record on Dr. King?
My first book on the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Protest at Selma, began as my undergraduate thesis at Wesleyan University in Connecticut in 1974. And that was published by Yale University Press in 1978, happily still in print as a paperback. And after I finished that book in 78, I realized I wanted to do something bigger about King. And I remember starting by reading the very first King biography by Lawrence D. Reddick over like the Christmas break of 1978. But by even like mid-1979, as I'm like reading all the literature on King, the big mystery then at that time was why had the FBI become so fixated on King and so fixated on King's closest white friend and advisor, Stanley Levison, a white guy in New York. Stan was an extremely selfless advisor to King from the late 1950s right up till 68. Stan was without question, the closest white acquaintance King ever had. So 79, 80, I am increasingly trying to solve this Levison mystery and talking to, people in the intelligence community generally. Now, keep in mind, 1979, there's no web, no internet, no computers. This is, rotary dial telephones. We don't have cell phones, but, no email, no cell phones. So I remember like cold calling Richard Helms, who'd been the director of the CIA, at his home. And Helms says, I don't know, call Jim Angleton, who was the head of FBI counterintelligence. I called Jim Angleton. Angleton says, well, talk to Pete Bagley in Brussels. So I call Tenant Pete Bagley in Brussels. So I'm just stumbling around. I'm 25, 26 years old. And then come August of 1980. By August of 1980, I knew that I had the riddle I had to solve was that there were these two brothers, one a public figure, one a secret figure, who'd been in the American Communist Party and had been FBI informants who put the finger on Levison. And I'd picked up that big hint from a very odd writer who had talked to William Sullivan, head of FBI counterintelligence, just before Sullivan had been killed in a hunting accident in New Hampshire. So I contacted out of the blue someone who's now been one of my oldest friends, Harvey Clare, K-L-E-H-R of Emory University, who was like, even then, sort of the historian of the American CPUSA. And Harvey called some of the ex-communists who he had interviewed, guys who dropped out of the party mainly in the 1950s. And so Harvey calls me back after having spoken to a guy in Minnesota and says the names that fit this riddle are Morris and Jack Childs. And so I called Chick Brennan, who was Sullivan's successor as head of FBI intelligence in the 1960s, whom I'd already spoken to. And I say to Brennan, Now I know the people I want to ask you about are Morris and Jack Childs. To which Brennan says, how do you know those names? Well, voila. And then I think literally the next day I get called by the then current head of the Foreign Counterintelligence Unit at Bureau headquarters, who says he's coming to see me in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where I was at that time. So that's how my FBI book came into being in 1981. The Bureau offered various carrots and sticks to try to get me to forget that I knew about the Childs brothers, who were then still alive. I think Jack died that same month that I found out his name. But Morris and his wife were living under witness protection in Miami Beach, Florida. So I get offered, would you like to go meet President Carter at the White House? This is late 1980. Then early 1981, would you like to go meet President Reagan? I say, no. Well, there's this thing called the Espionage Act of 1917 that, covers things like revealing classified information. And I said some polite version of, a word that begins with F. So the book comes out. The FBI book is published in September of 81, gets front page coverage in the Washington Post. And, but that's mainly a book about the FBI. I mean, in that book, King and the people around him are the targets or the victims. Then I go back to working on what becomes Bearing the Cross. The great advantage I had all the way from 1979 up through 1985 was that the vast majority of people who had really known Dr. King were all still alive then. And there, up until that time, had not been much active interest in doing civil rights history. So most people hadn't been interviewed much, if at all. You learn being a historian that once someone gets interviewed 7, 9, 10 times, they tend to develop a recitative and it becomes the same thing over and over again. So the first few times someone is interviewed about something is always by far the best. So these people were available and they weren't yet jaded by some, army of graduate students, taking up all their time. So I first met Dorothy Cotton, who becomes, one of the, arguably the most important person in King's life, in September of 79. And so I spent that next 6 years while teaching at Chapel Hill, doing all the legwork on this, writing most of it there in Chapel Hill in 83, 84. And then it got published in the fall of 86. We didn't really, the other thing I should have is very early 87, right after that book comes out, is when Eyes on the Prize, big PBS documentary series on the Southern Black freedom struggle, when the first 6 episodes of Eyes are telecast. And it was really Eyes on the Prize that made civil rights history into something of wider interest and popularity. And I think no doubt my winning the Pulitzer in the spring of 87 almost inescapably was aided by Eyes on the Prize happening at exactly that same time. And I'd been one of the 3 main academics behind Eyes. And the Eyes producers likewise did a phenomenal job of going around and both interviewing people and digging out old archival film footage. And there is nothing in modern America more difficult than film research. because a lot of stuff survives, but it's not easily accessible. The networks want to charge folks an arm and a leg for it. My good friend Jonathan Eig, who's done the most recent King biography, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 2024. King, once upon a time, appeared on The Tonight Show when Harry Belafonte was guest hosting for Johnny Carson. And that, it survived. I guess NBC's the right network. But just to see, that footage of King with Harry Belafonte, they always did the show live at whatever, 11:30 at night. You could clearly tell that King had had more than a few drinks at dinner and they're yucking it up. But just to get access to footage like that, it's a very difficult enterprise. Having, worked on multiple historical documentary film projects over the years, film researchers are wildly underappreciated.
Yeah, no, for sure. Just so the listener gets this, and this is typical for you with your Barack Obama bio, it's the same. Tons of footnotes. It's just awesome book. It's a great book to have as a resource. But I just want to make sure, they should have already heard it, but just to make sure they hear, a lot of these are interviews you did originally.
Oh, yes.
That you tracked down these people, interviewed them, asked them specific questions, things they saw, heard, witnessed. And so
and the tape cassettes, the little sort of 3x5 size tape cassettes of those are all in sealed plastic cartons right behind you over here in a set of cupboards.
Wow. It's just amazing. We can't thank you enough for doing this kind of work. And like you said, at that time,
it's imperative to me. It's imperative for all scholars to do completely comprehensive footnoting, because you never know who's going to come along and want to pursue one particular aspect of something. Now, I've been doing this, coming up on 50 years now, and I don't have 10 days go by without someone contacting me and saying, oh, my grandmother was Clara McTurnan, and she's a character in the first chapter of your reproductive rights history on Griswold and Roe v. Wade. I mentioned to you before we started filming that I've just finished reading and writing a review of a superb new comprehensive history on the Supreme Court of the United States by a UCLA law professor named Stuart Banner. And when I'm reading a book that I'm going to review, I read every footnote. And so I'm not unique. I mean, Professor Banner's endnotes to this book are 100% comprehensive, really impressive. It made me feel overjoyed that I'm not quite the last dinosaur.
Right. Well, just so you know, so you can see, I'm marking up your footnotes as well. And I love, you always put little gems in there for the reader who puts in the time, the attention. So it really pays off, and I highly recommend
one
this.
Other good research story I should quickly relate.
Yeah.
That will be useful to anyone who's doing any sort of research nowadays. Back when I was doing BTC, to look at old newspapers, African American newspapers from the 1950s and 1960s, meant microfilm readers and microfilm printers. Now, anyone under the age of 50 or 55 in this country has probably never had to use microfilm. So you've got this roll of microfilm, and it's like the Atlanta Daily World for 1956, or the Birmingham World for a few months in 1956. And if you want to see what they're saying about the Montgomery bus boycott, you've got to scan this thing as moving the film along with a hand crank. And it is literally, for me at least, nausea-inducing. So fast forward to the present. My friend Jonathan Eig, whom I mentioned earlier, one of the great advantages John had doing this new comprehensive King book the last 5 years compared to life in the 1980s was virtually all surviving African-American newspapers have been digitized. So microfilm is obsolete, and the digitizations are searchable. So he's finding things like articles in the Atlanta Daily World that King published as a teenager, which we not just me, the Martin Luther King Papers Project at Stanford hadn't known about.
Wow.
Digitization, though it's not, errors happen in digitization, but it opens up, especially for Black history, a tremendous amount of historical territory that is now searchable and accessible in a way that wasn't even 20 years ago.
Right, it's amazing. So just to put these pieces together for the listener who has not encountered your work yet, right? You have a law background, you're a legal expert, historian, you've dealt with the FBI, you've written a book of record, not just a book of record. You've also written books about King.
Right.
But, and so you're the perfect person to talk to about sources, historicity, trustworthiness of this or that source. I just want the listener to really, hopefully it's sunk in already. It hasn't yet.
I mean, oral history is essential, but you also cannot be, and some writers have had this problem very seriously, you can't necessarily believe everything that someone says to you.
Right.
In the Montgomery bus boycott from 1956, one of the most heroic figures in that was an older working class Black gentleman, E.D. Nixon, Edgar Daniel Nixon, worked as a Pullman porter on interstate trains. He was like Mr. NAACP in Montgomery long before Martin Luther King gets there as a 25, 26-year-old pastor. Well, notwithstanding Mr. Nixon's greatness, no one interviewing Mr. Nixon in the 1970s or 1980s could really depend on his version of events because he wanted to embrace a memory that he was the person that elevated Martin Luther King to leadership. Well, that's not what actually happened. And so you always have to be on guard for stories that are too good to be true.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And you use other sources to piece together and then weigh probability. So this is, anyway, that's a fascinating example.
And contemporary documents are almost always more reliable than human memory. I remember very clearly, sometime in the early 80s, going to interview Burke Marshall at Yale Law School, who had been head of the Civil Rights Division at the Justice Department during the Kennedy administration. Burke was the guy that dealt not only with Dr. King, but with everybody in the Southern Black freedom struggle from 61 to 64. And I remember Marshall saying to me, now, did Albany happen before Birmingham, or did Birmingham happen before Albany? Albany was 61, 62, Birmingham is 63. And I'm thinking, he lived this and he's asking me to tell him which order these events took place in. So that was a very, very, very important lesson for me. Human beings' ability to place a memory in time is the most imperfect aspect of all in human memory.
So in 2019, you write an article for Standpoint, The Troubling Legacy of Martin Luther King. Just dense, informative article. And details some of the more, might I say, disturbing,
Problematic.
dark elements of King's private life. In that article, you call for a reappraisal of King's legacy, even a, quote, painful historical reckoning. What led you to that? I know I don't want to overdo a discontinuity between the FBI book, Bearing the Cross, and this article, but at the same time, what led to this article in particular?
There are, in a sort of big picture, rough sense, there are sort of three pieces to that answer. When I first started doing the legwork for the FBI book in 79, 80, not only did I interview whatever former FBI agents were willing to talk to me, I also interviewed everyone in the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division who in the 1970s had investigated the FBI's antipathy towards King back in the 1960s. And those lawyers from the criminal section in the Civil Rights Division had reviewed all of the FBI material regarding King, both from the wiretaps on King and the microphone surveillances that the FBI placed on King in various hotels as he traveled around the country. Now, it's important to quickly note that while the wiretapping was begun and authorized by Robert Kennedy as Attorney General and absolutely known about by his brother, John, as president, and then later on Lyndon Johnson as president, while the wiretapping was premised on this hypothesis that Stanley Levison, King's closest white friend, was still some sort of communist Soviet agent. Now, Stanley had been, before he met Dr. King, a very important actor in the Soviets' financial subsidies that were going to the American Communist Party. Levison dropped out of that role before he met King. But the Bureau, when it discovers tardily in 1962 that Levison was King's closest advisor, understandably has the hypothesis, has this former communist Soviet loyalist befriended Martin Luther King for some nefarious intelligence purpose. So that's the grounding for starting to wiretap Levison, which to my mind is perfectly understandable. Now, they find nothing. There's no indication that Levison, in talking with King, is representing anybody other than himself. And Levison's making it clear to like his twin brother and his other, old friends that he's put those communist loyalties as behind him pretty much as he totally could. But the surveillances on Levison and two of King's other advisors in New York by August of 1963, right in the lead up to the March on Washington, those surveillances when King is staying at the home of one of his other lawyer friends, that cues the Bureau into the fact that King is also having sexual affairs with multiple women, sometimes calling 3 or 4 of them on the same day. These are from the wiretaps of the home of his lawyer friend, Clarence Jones. Now, the documentary record is crystal clear that learning that King has this private life vulnerability is what leads the FBI to ask Bobby Kennedy to approve wiretapping King himself under the pretense of the King-Levison relationship, and to then also, soon after November of 1963, to begin pursuing King with these hotel microphone bugs. Now, under the law at that time, the Attorney General could approve wiretapping, which was legal. Bugging, which was legal, was done internally by the FBI, going back to some Supreme Court decisions from the 1930s, Nardone versus United States principally. So there was this game even within the FBI. Oh, we're doing all this to look for communist influence. No, Bill Sullivan, as head of the intelligence division, was doing this to get sexual dirt on King. Now, all of the microphone stuff in the hotel rooms on 3 or 4 particular occasions captures King and a number of his male friends having these, there's no better word for it, orgies with multiple women, multiple guys. And the FBI has those tape recordings transcribed in full, total, excruciating detail. In the technology of 1964 was they would take these microphone bugs, which had little transmitters, short distance transmitters then, and with the complicity of hotel managers, they would plant these bugs in lamps in the rooms that King and his friends were going to be using. And then they'd have a team of agents with old reel-to-reel tape recorders in literally the room next door or the room right upstairs. Those were prized recordings in the FBI of 1964 and 1965. They tried to persuade journalists at that time to write about this. But the ethics of journalism in the 1960s were such that even if a member of the U.S. Senate showed up drunk on the floor, visibly drunk on the floor of the United States Senate, that would not be written about. The article might say that Senator Long was in high spirits, as a code. So in 1964 and 1965, hundreds of people in Washington, in the Justice Department, in the White House, in the press corps, various religious leaders who were friends of the FBI, everyone knew that Martin Luther King had this sub rosa sex life involving multiple women, but anyone reading the newspaper would not have learned this. This wasn't unique to King. John F. Kennedy, as president, is sexually abusing female interns in the White House, instructing them to provide sexual favors to his political buddies as he watches.
While he's president.
Yeah, as president, in the White House then swimming pool. That was the reality, or the gender reality, of American political leadership in the 1960s. Now, in the 1970s, the congressional investigating committees reviewed much of the FBI material, but purposely avoided the hotel recordings, though the Justice Department lawyers had listened to it all. So I've known since 1979, 1980, from the memories of the Justice Department lawyers, what they remembered from those recordings. And there's a paragraph in my 1981 FBI book that talks about some of that. And it's garbled because I'm relying on the memories of 2 lawyers who heard this stuff, and they get it a little bit wrong. So fast forward to 2018, when the National Archives publicly releases almost everything of what the congressional committees got from the FBI back in the 70s. And that includes a lot more sort of second generation summaries, descriptions, quotations of material from the original FBI recordings that still remain themselves the originals under a court seal until 2027. Now, that material that the National Archives publicly put up on the web, still on the web. Anyone who's got a web browser and a lot of patience can access every piece of it. Though they are PDF, they are hundreds of PDF files that are usually themselves hundreds of pages. And you have to have a pretty good understanding of either FBI and or CIA records and document practices, what we call serialization, the numbering of documents, to be able to make meaningful use of those. Now, since I spent all of the early 1980s doing Freedom of Information Act requests, getting the FBI headquarters files on King and Leveson and the wiretap logs, that's an expertise I've had for over 40 years now. So it was time consuming, but not at all impossible for me to fully review all of the NARA materials, which, documented in more detail most of what the Justice Department lawyers had recounted to me back in 1979, 1980. Now, there's still, because of the other material that's still under the court seal, there are other things I know going back to 1979, 1980 that I've not written about because the specific documents related to those won't be out till 2027. So there are additional shoes to drop, so to speak, still in the future.
Yeah, and you know this.
Yeah.
So we will get more of this kind of material going forward.
Let me give a little sort of two-piece summary here. We know now, I knew in 1980, 81, I certainly knew when I published Bearing the Cross in 86, that King had never been monogamous, that he had had multiple relationships with women, some of which, as with Dorothy Cotton, were very serious. Really among the most important human relationships of his life. But then there were other, polite phrase, one-night stands in various cities. Now, John Eige's more recent book, in thanks to the new NARA documentation, we now know that, between 63 and 68, King had relationships with somewhere between 40 and 45 women. And I think it's clear to say that from what we know, even prior to the FBI surveillance, that King was having relationships, predating 1963. He and Coretta had married, before they go to Montgomery in 1955. The other important piece of this is that back in the early 80s, I was aware that by 1967, 1968, King had a drinking problem. What I think nowadays we would call a proclivity for binge drinking. Not necessarily drinking every night, but sometimes drinking to the point where he was not in control of himself. Now, it's even clearer now, and again, thanks to the NARA releases in 2018, that the seriousness of that drinking problem existed even in early 1964. So when we talk about these multi-person orgies that got recorded by the FBI in various hotel rooms, or even the Las Vegas incident where a Las Vegas prostitute is interviewed in great detail by local law enforcement about her interactions with King. And those documents are all in the NARA release. No redactions at all. I'd known back in the 80s this had happened, but we didn't have any full documents detailing it. But it's clear that having an alcohol problem was an aspect of King's life. And it's an aspect of his life that was directly involved in some of these sexual escapades. But I've always found this to be the most difficult part to speak about, because you don't want to veer into the moral error of seeming to excuse his treatment of women based on the fact that he was drunk. Right. I said that, and I said that this time exactly right.
Yes. Yeah. You said somewhere around 40, 45 women, some very long term, others not so much.
The other one thing I should add to this, which is really important to me, and it's a crucial issue for anyone doing recent history of any stripe. When I first met Dorothy Cotton in 1979, I already knew that she had been more than just a colleague of King's. And Dorothy was very happy to talk with me, later on talk to my good friend Jason Miller at North Carolina State about Dr. King. But Dorothy also made it very clear, without saying so expressly, that she did not want to be publicly pigeonholed as Dr. King's romantic partner. She wanted to be acknowledged and appreciated for her own substantive role as a civil rights worker. And so in 1981, in 1986, all the way up until Dorothy passed away, I always avoided using Dorothy's name in public as King's real wife, as all of us King scholars have used that phrase for a good many years. Living people have privacy rights. Dead people don't. And that's the rule I've always followed. A lot of senior journalists of my generation have followed that rule too. That there are things you hold back in order to protect the rightful privacy interests of folks who are still alive. Now, virtually no one from that part of King's life is still with us.
Right. And just to reemphasize what you said, Dorothy Cotton never explicitly discussed this aspect, even though you knew that was there.
I'm certain. I know of at least three other people, all folks I've known well over the years, who spoke to Dorothy in later years after me. One of whom I know said something to her along the lines of, please sit down with a tape recorder, make a recording, put the tape in a manila envelope, seal it, write a date on it. I don't think she ever did that.
Yeah. Did you ever interview any of the other women?
I never actively looked for them. I've known, even now I have in my head multiple names. Dolores Evans' name has been public record for a long time. Dolores Evans is still alive. Dolores Evans had a child in 1964 whom very possibly, very, very, very possibly is Martin Luther King's fifth child. But with me, with Taylor Branch, with Jonathan Eig, neither Mrs. Evans nor her daughter has ever been willing to talk. Even though when her daughter got married, the wedding ceremony got married out in California, the officiant at the daughter's wedding was Andrew Young from Georgia, Dr. King's closest surviving associate. I still remember when I first came across the photos of that. King enjoyed seducing women. And from those wiretaps from August of 1963, we've gotten verbatim transcripts of him calling 3 women, Dorothy Cotton being one of them, in succession some afternoon over the course of an hour, hour and a half. I'm not a naive person, but I don't like I have trouble with the way in which King would speak to multiple women in almost identical words. That he had a sort of MO, and this is not after he's had 7 drinks. But again, if you look back at American history, King was not unique. We can go back to Thomas Jefferson, or in the modern era, Franklin Roosevelt, Dwight Eisenhower, certainly John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson. There is a pattern of male behavior, or certainly behavior by males in important, prominent public roles. And this is a gender aspect of history that we have to acknowledge.
Right. Why is the FBI so concerned about King here? I know you point out that the narrative is the association with communists, and I have more questions on that later, but it seems, like you said, that this is, they know this is more normal behavior, as wrong as it is. So why that obsession, King's private life?
The FBI, and Bill Sullivan is more important to this in most respects than J. Edgar Hoover. And the guys working directly under Sullivan, particularly Seymour Phillips, who was the sort of headquarters supervisor for the King case. Sullivan thought of himself as the FBI's house liberal, and in some respects he was, compared to J. Edgar Hoover. Sullivan had a paternalistic view of black people. He did not think he was a racist. Sullivan, and indeed Hoover himself, had close political friendships with a number of prominent black leaders. There was a black church leader based in Baltimore, Elder Solomon Michaud, not remembered by white people nowadays, but the first black person to have a syndicated television program. Now, Michaud was a good buddy of Hoover's. Actually arranged for some of his followers to picket one of King's civil rights conventions in Baltimore. Wow. At the behest of the FBI. Reverend Archibald Carey in Chicago, who was an old friend of the King family, was also a friend of Hoover. The FBI also had close relationships with Thurgood Marshall, before he becomes a famous Supreme Court justice, others at the NAACP, Jim Farmer, the head of the Congress of Racial Equality. So the FBI, even Hoover, were not simply racist in some, Ku Klux Klan robe-wearing sort of way. Sullivan thought that black people needed to be protected by the FBI from a religious figure who was as morally imperfect as King, as he knew King was. And so that is the FBI's motivation in pursuing the sexual material. They want to expose and depose King so that he can be replaced by a more upstanding black leader. And they actually pick out, Sullivan picks out an obscure New York lawyer, later a member of President Reagan's cabinet, Samuel Pierce, as the ideal successor. I should say, too, within the bounds of whatever is tasteful language, that all of those FBI guys, and I can remember having this experience with Chick Brennan, Sullivan's deputy, myself, in some detail, they had extremely narrow or old-fashioned understanding of what human sexuality entailed. And so their cultural lens, when they are reviewing the intimate details of King's life, their cultural boundaries are much, much narrower than King's, or much more narrow than traditional American black culture, or much narrower even than John F. Kennedy's sexual boundaries. So it's the concatenation of those two things, having a very narrow scale for human sexuality and having this paternalistic view of black Americans.
Yeah, and when they say this will make him easy to blackmail, like you said, it is interesting that though maybe a lot of journalists were aware of this information, they're not reporting it.
Right.
So it's kind of this open secret among certain people that are connected. Is there stock in that view that he could be blackmailed, so we got to be ahead?
No. I mean, Sullivan individually, that the infamous anonymous package that Sullivan has mailed to King, including this anonymous threatening letter and a highlights reel of the hotel room microphone recordings. Sullivan's goal is to get King scared to the point that he'll retire.
Okay.
Now, that letter can be read quite easily as encouraging suicide.
By Christmas Day, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we know from the ongoing telephone wiretaps when the package finally gets opened, that King has no doubt who really sent this. And it has a traumatic psychological effect on King. King had episodic depressions for which he was hospitalized. My colleague Nasir Ghaemi, Ghaemi, who's a MD psychiatry professor at Tufts Harvard, Nasir has a forthcoming book that talks, analyzes King's history with the insights of a empathetic academic psychiatrist. It's had a great effect on my own thinking. But at the same time, King is now fully on notice that the FBI is surveilling him for sexual purposes. Does King's behavior change in the wake of that knowledge? No, it does not.
That's just, yeah. Can we land on a specific set of incidents? This is one that I think is about as bad as it can get. And I just want the listener to make sure they realize how bad it can get within the context of seducing women. And then, of course, I have a question here in a minute about his wife, Coretta, who I feel very sorry for reading about this. But January 1964, at the Willard Hotel, Pennsylvania Avenue.
Right.
Will you explain? And I know this leads to the anonymous package, so this can link to what you were just talking about.
The Willard recordings in early January 64, they knew King was going to be there because he wants to be present for the Supreme Court argument in what becomes a famous case, Sullivan versus New York Times Company, which involved some Alabama officials suing the New York Times for having published a paid advertisement in support of King. It's one of the best known cases now in First Amendment law of libel and defamation. So they elaborately prepared for King and his friends being at the Willard. They had this team of agents from the Washington field office, the sound men. The management at the Willard Hotel is all in on this, cooperating with them. And that ends up generating something like 365, pages of transcript over the course of several days. We've known going back to the 1980s that this happened, but only the 2018 archives document dump fleshed out some of the details of that. Keep in mind that the full transcription and all of the surviving recordings, they're sitting there in a vault at National Archives headquarters on Pennsylvania Avenue, about 5-6 blocks from the Willard Hotel.
Not far.
They've never gone very far. The court seal on that expires in 2027. And with Donald Trump as president, as we've seen recently with his executive order under the JFK covering the JFK Records Act materials, that material will come out in full, in early 2027.
Mm-hmm. I know some people say, well, these are FBI records. Can we even trust them? To quote from your article, these are the descriptions in these, and I know some people want to dismiss it because of the FBI and of course the obvious questionable motives there. But this is one night. The group met in his room and discussed which women among the parishioners, my understanding is of a fellow pastor.
Parishioners itself is a King World code word, because the women were not actually parishioners; they were civilian employees at the Philadelphia Naval Yard.
Oh,
but parishioners was King and Ralph Abernathy and the other ministers had a vocabulary of code words. Parishioners is one. Counsel as a verb is another. Chicken as a noun is another. Now, I think some listeners can probably figure out what other verb counsel would be a code word for. I think many black people, or black people of my generation at least, would be able to translate chicken. But I don't think most white folks would understand the chicken joke.
Mm. And so these are pastors, and they're discussing, I guess you see some of the wording, natural or unnatural sex acts. When one of the women protested that she did not approve of this, the Baptist minister immediately and forcibly raped her. King looked on, laughed, and offered advice. And this is the audio of which we'll see in 2027. So that's just an example of something that could come out. And the next night, participated in a sex orgy. When one of the women shied away from engaging in an unnatural act, King and several of the men discussed how she was to be taught and initiated in this respect. King told her that to perform such an act would help her soul. So, yeah, it's pretty rough.
Keep in mind, we touched on this earlier, and I'm going to try to do this without becoming 100% explicit. Given the FBI guys' own cultural boundaries, unnatural sex acts include at least a trio. Yeah, that's a very good way to put it. A trio of things that at least two of which of that trio are, I think, unquestionably widely popular sexual practices. This is like it's like this is the lesson of the Nixon Watergate expletives. If you redact some phrase and don't leave the exact wording in there, people reading it think that it's that the missing phrase is the worst thing they could imagine. Now, with regard to some of the specifics of what you've read there, let me say only that both forms of oral sex fall within the FBI's description, the FBI's version of unnatural. Now, as that passage also reveals, and this again, this is not unique to King. I can think of a famous incident maybe a decade ago now in New York involving the then president of the World Bank, French guy. Women, as that indicates, women might show up for something expecting that the menu is going to be vanilla ice cream. But when the menu turns to tutti frutti or chocolate, they're not interested in that part of the menu. I think that's the best sort of metaphor. To put it in a modern parlance, people might consent to one aspect of things and then try to refuse their consent to other aspects of things. Now, we have a published memoir by one of these JFK White House interns that where she's going back, looking back at her life as a 18, 19-year-old in the White House, and she's Mimi Beardsley Alford, and she is reflecting upon in her own life, her own memoir, exactly that sort of experience with John F. Kennedy and Kennedy's buddy Dave Powers. She thought she had agreed to one thing, and all of a sudden the president of the United States is telling her to do something else. So I always want to stress that King should not be examined in isolation.
No, and I think that's context is absolutely, it's an imperative.
I would add too, and this is something I reflect upon regularly, anyone who's old enough to remember the Bill Clinton, Monica Lewinsky scandal from the late 1990s, where Miss Lewinsky was, again, a White House intern who was taken advantage of, I think largely willingly taken advantage of by the President of the United States. And having been in the Oval Office, having been in the President's dining room off the Oval Office, I have seen that exact territory, for multiple hours. I think that the intensity of the public attention on Bill Clinton's behavior with Miss Lewinsky, I think that to a significant degree partially reformed, male behavior towards women. Now, Harvey Weinstein, I don't know the timeline on Mr. Weinstein's offenses terribly well, or Jeffrey Epstein's. And I don't think that President Clinton is necessarily at all comparable to Weinstein or Epstein. But I do think that if I ever were to meet Miss Lewinsky, I think I'd say to her something along the lines of, what you went through, I think as a historian, has across the board led to at least some improvement in the ways in which powerful men behave with vulnerable younger women.
Yeah. And hopefully bringing attention to this help further that. I can't help but think, and this isn't really pushing back. It's just MLK is a pastor. He's a Baptist minister. A lot of our audience are Southern Baptists, SBC variety, and this is where it's just. This isn't just aimed right at him. He's surrounded by ministers who are publicly teaching one thing. And you point this out in your book, right? That there's, quote, a great distance between King's professed beliefs and private life. King publicly spoke of sexuality being sacred, properly used only in marriage. Stated, quote, therefore sex must never be abused in the loose sense that it is often abused in the modern world. Ralph Abernathy also states this. We all understood and believed in the biblical prohibition against sex outside of marriage.
Let me take the initiative and say two things. One where I'm not expert at all, one where I am. Where I'm not expert, I think that we all, and certainly the vast majority of your viewers or listeners, know that sexual misbehavior by pastors of all stripes, this covers like big Protestant or Baptist congregations in Texas comes to mind, or Catholic clergy,
sure,
with younger people, particularly younger boys. Now, I certainly have asked myself the question multiple times over the years, is sexual misconduct or sexual abuse more common among clergymen than among plumbers or electricians? Now, or is it more common than among U.S. senators? We had an episode recently at a Senate hearing where Senator Mullen from Oklahoma openly suggested to several of his colleagues that they shouldn't be so tough on Pete Hegseth, now the Secretary of Defense, given what Senator Mullen thought he knew about their own behavior over the years. I'm not sure how much, airtime that's received, but it was a pretty powerful moment. My own distilled impression is that pastors are men in positions of authority, relative authority, over congregations, over parishioners. King and his buddies aren't using parishioners as a code word randomly. They're just, some members of their parishioners aren't really parishioners, but a lot of parishioners were parishioners. Abernathy certainly practiced that back in Montgomery. That was public record back then even. I worked in the U.S. Senate in 1972, Watergate summer. And I was very aware then, as someone who, was barely 20 years old, that U.S. senators were not a paragon population. There was a senator on our floor, senator from Montana, whom I observed about 11 o'clock in the morning, so drunk he was speaking to a marble pillar. And I remember how women in our office would go out in the hallway to see Senator Ted Kennedy walk by. or going to the office of a senator from California. One of my jobs was to take dear colleague letters around and get signatures, auto pen signatures from various other Senate offices. You go to the senator from Rhode Island and all the women in his office are over the age of 65. You go to the office of the senator from California and every employee is female, under 30 and blonde. So it wasn't, you didn't have to be terribly perceptive to realize what's going on. Second point, King, and I know you've already read this, King always insistently spoke about viewing himself as a sinner. He was incredibly self-critical about his behavior at the same time that he did not stop it. So we have in particular, I've quoted this, I know I quoted in the article from 2019, it's somewhere in BTC as well, where King in a sermon late in life says there is some, I may not get every word quite correct here, there is some Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in all of us. So King had enough of a reflective ability and self-critical ability to realize that even in the best of human beings, they can commit acts of evil. And he knows this all along. This is in his preaching, even early on, where he talks, many, many times about distinguishing between the evil act and the evil doer. So King always, whether it's Bull Connor or guys who bombed his house in Montgomery, King always believed that all of humanity was savable, no matter what evil deeds they may have committed. Now, I think King, this is just my own opinion, I think King underestimated the power, the breadth of human evil, because he'd grown up in a very privileged, segregated, but nonetheless very privileged childhood, young adulthood. He had, experienced racism a few times up through his early 20s, but not to the degree that the vast majority of Black people in the South had. King comes of age after World War II, 50s and 60s. The world is relatively peaceful. The world's recovering from the aftermath of World War II. King is worried about the specter of nuclear weapons, but that's, no one's using them. It's a theoretical threat. It's not the world of Vladimir Putin and Hamas or what's going on in Western Sudan or the Great Lakes area of the Eastern Congo and Rwanda nowadays. So I think King underappreciated humanity's capacity for evil. I don't think King had read widely about the Holocaust, though granted, our historiographical literature about the Holocaust in large part postdates King's life. But I really want to underscore the intensity with which King publicly acknowledged seeing himself as a serial sinner.
Yeah, and he even says in that same sermon, we are often unfaithful to those we should be faithful to. And yet, yeah, I think you quote him as saying, he imagines the universe is basically good.
Oh, yes.
So that tension in his thinking,
Yeah.
Not to belabor this point before moving on to more interesting material, but I just wish, and I'm not just putting it all on him, I wish some of the ministers around him would have confronted him about this behavior, and vice versa. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. There's one, I mean, this is in both my book and in Jonathan Ives' book. There's an older friend of Daddy King, J. Raymond Henderson, who writes King a letter that we've seen since the 1970s. Writes King a letter in the late 50s, warning him, saying you're in an exposed position, beware of this. But it's more a letter telling him to, be careful, cover your tracks, rather than cut it out. In all frankness, I think in the world of most clergy around King, this was known. Now, some people, I'll give you an example. Someone who's still with us, at least at this present moment, Andy Young. Andy Young did not participate in that. So it's very clear from all the telephone wiretap intercepts who the other guys were who were in the sort of, if you will, party guy circle along with King. Wyatt Walker, who worked with King, a lawyer down in South Florida named Henry Arrington. Arrington's a good example of something else. The FBI were excellent, but utterly literal transcriptionists. They're generally very good when they're listening in on Dr. King because they can understand what all these folks are talking about. The wiretap intercepts on the Nation of Islam, on Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad, where they're talking about Joseph 25X. The FBI didn't understand the internal cultural world of the Nation of Islam, and so they have trouble figuring out in the Nation of Islam wiretaps who's who. They don't know the lingo. Now, when they first discover Henry Arrington on the wiretaps, they mishear the name. They start looking for someone named Henry Harrington in South Florida. And it takes them a long time to figure out what they got wrong. Same thing with, you mentioned parishioners early. The FBI, when we look at when we see the full transcript of that, the FBI isn't culturally aware enough to realize that parishioners was a code word.
Mm. And just you studying, you doing these interviews, you're starting to get this kind of outside talk. So you're able to kind of.
Yeah, I mean, I've spent, all those years, I've spent enough of my life in majority black settings. And then again, when I was doing my big book on Barack Obama, and even when I was running political campaigns in North Carolina in the late 1970s, on more than one occasion, I spoke from the pulpit in a Black Baptist church. So just my own upbringing, not just as a scholar, but even in my own life, I've always been 100% comfortable in majority or virtually all African-American contexts. I had an interaction with a African-American Pittsburgh bus driver just this past weekend that involved a nice little interplay of humor that requires a white boy understanding black vernacular.
Did Coretta know?
Yes. Did she acknowledge it? No. And I'll tell you, Marion Logan, who was one of the officers of the board of King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Marion Logan was a very distinguished figure in Black New York. She'd been a singer for Duke Ellington. Her husband, Arthur Logan, was one of King's personal physicians, a very distinguished figure. I remember Marion telling me, this is back 1983 or 4, this is when I realized King had a serious drinking problem late in life. Marion described to me being at King's home, 234 Sunset Avenue Southwest in Atlanta, sometime I think in early 68. And King was sitting up in bed, drinking from a big bottle of vodka. Drinking vodka from the bottle. And Coretta walks in, sees this, walks out. So that has always, for me, been the metaphor for how Coretta processed or didn't process what was going on. Now, I remember Bill Rutherford, who was executive director of SCLC in the late years, telling me, recounting to me going to King's house once to look for him, and he wasn't there. He was actually at the secret hideaway apartment that he had for spending time with Dorothy Cotton. And realizing that, Rutherford was ignorant of some of this, that he was fairly new to the organization, and that Coretta understood what was going on even though he didn't, and how embarrassed Rutherford felt about that interaction. Now, Coretta in later years, if anybody would ask her, would sort of laugh it off and say, oh no, if that had happened, I would have known about it. I'm a historian, I'm not a psychologist. So why and how do people choose to deny the existence of something that they clearly do perceive? That's, in the vernacular, beyond my pay grade.
Do you think she did?
Oh, I'm certain she knew. I have no doubt.
How do people not?
I would also,
I
spent a lot of time around the King Center from 1980 through 85, 86. So I saw Mrs. King on multiple occasions. For several of those years, Dorothy Cotton, early 80s, after the Carter administration ended, Dorothy was working at the King Center.
Wow.
Fred Bennett, who had worked for Dr. King, Fred oversaw the hideaway. Fred was working at the King Center. So this is a very, might we say, incestuous world. Now, what I can say, the best way to say this, is that I know from listening to multiple staff members at the King Center in the early 80s, that it was their belief that Mrs. King had never, from 1968 up through then, had an additional personal relationship, post-assassination personal relationship. That's the best way to say it.
Yeah.
Because that was a subject that clearly these people who worked for her year after year, this was something they thought about.
Right. There's one piece of evidence in these FBI files that she's confronting him more about never being home, which you do point out that King had his view was, you stay home, take care of the kids, I go out, save the world.
King's travel schedule, King's speaking schedule was year after year akin to the final 4 months of a presidential campaign. And even when he was in Atlanta, it's very clear from the FBI surveillance that he was spending more time with Dorothy than at home. And so, yes, they have from late 63 until the spring of 65, the FBI has a wiretap on the home phone. Again, we'll have those logs, those transcripts in 2027. So the FBI is quite aware that he's spending more time with Dorothy. And Coretta is exactly right. He's not home very much.
Right. Do you think, I guess we'll find out if he told her to have affairs of her own?
I mean, as I touched on earlier, the FBI was, textualist, literalist in its transcriptions.
So it's not always subtle.
The late Bayard Rustin, who was also wiretapped, close friend of King's. Bayard was wiretapped throughout those years. And Bayard lived long enough till 1987 that he got to read the FBI's, the FBI's logs of the tap on his own home. And I know Bayard did a long oral history with Columbia University in which he, laughingly affirmed the accuracy of, what the FBI has him saying. So, the historical record is very clear that even people who were themselves wiretapped can attest to the accuracy of what the FBI was doing. Now, the FBI would manufacture documents, as would the anonymous letter to King, and anonymous letters that it sent not just to black radicals, but also to Klansmen. I mean, the FBI used the same exact dirty tricks that it had first developed to damage communists to also go after Klansmen. And these often had a sexual motif of trying to get people in some Klan organization upset with their fellow Klansmen by sending anonymous letters saying, so-and-so is sleeping with your wife. Same thing that they later did with supporters of the Black Panthers in Southern California, which is widely viewed as having led to the suicide of a once upon a time famous actress. So the COINTELPRO is the right. But the COINTEL type of actions predated the creation of the COINTELPRO label. The worst thing, arguably, the FBI did was towards a very loyal communist in New York named William Albertson, and they snitch-jacketed him. Now, you have to come from an intelligence background to know what that means. It means falsely painting someone as an informant. So the FBI was worried about the American communist leadership sniffing out the real informants, Jack and Morris Childs. So the FBI decides, we're going to take a loyal communist and falsely document him as the informant to throw them off of examining Jack or Morris. So they have they steal some stationery that, what back in those days was called bag jobs. They were regularly doing, the break-ins were illegal. The wiretaps, the microphones were legal. The break-ins, the bag jobs were illegal, and they knew it. And so they're not documented. They're documented in code. A source who cannot be recontacted is the usual lingo. So they would break into Communist Party headquarters at 2 a.m, and they'd go in with an old Leica camera and they'd take pictures of documents. Well, so this time they steal some blank stationery from this guy's office. They give the blank stationery to the FBI lab, and the FBI lab recreates this target gentleman's handwriting. So it's his paper, and they do the handwriting. And then they have what appears to be an informant report. They plant it on the floorboard of a car that this fellow had been in for some other communist to discover the next day. Well, the Communist Party leadership falls for this hook, line, and sinker. The guy is cashiered, thrown out of the party. His life is ruined. He's bankrupted. And the FBI thinks this is a great friggin' success. Totally destroyed this man's life. The Bureau viewed communism as so evil, so dangerous that they would do that. Even though, because of Morris and Jack Childs, by 1964, they, the FBI, are controlling the Communist Party. If they had wanted to shut it down, expose the fact that Moscow's sending over all this money to keep American communism running, they could have done it. But they continued to operate it. Now, they later do something pretty similar with a Maoist Communist Party, Chinese Communist supporters in the 1970s. We don't have the paper trail on that yet. And I don't know precisely I don't know with 100% certainty who the FBI's informants within the leadership of this Maoist party were. That's something that, it's again, one of these things that I know that I can't write about or talk about because we don't have supporting documents.
Wow. With this type of behavior from the FBI, I mentioned this earlier and I think I jumped the gun, but it seems like for those who, they'll see this egregious behavior by the Bureau and dismiss all the evidence. What are they missing?
You've got a small fringe of people who they hate law enforcement in toto. We see this with people who want to abolish prisons, or people who excuse folks who killed law enforcement officers. President Biden, at the end of his term, pardoned a Native American fellow, Leonard Peltier, who back in 1975 murdered 2 FBI agents. We've got people on the sort of radical left who celebrate former Black Panthers who killed law enforcement officers. A woman who's been a fugitive in Cuba for 45 plus years or so now. So you've got this small fringe that just won't, 99% of people realize that the Freedom of Information Act and what we get thanks to the JFK Records Act, whether it's about the Kennedy assassination, whether it's about the FBI, whether it's about the CIA, that freedom of information is phenomenally valuable in exposing for the historical record what these agencies did at a time when no one in those agencies ever imagined that any of this would ever see the light of day. Prior to Hoover's death in 1972, prior to the first of the congressional investigating committees, the Church Committee in 1975, the intelligence agencies thought that they were impermeable for all time. So they weren't in the business of deceiving themselves. They wanted to deceive other people. There's this tiny fringe that doesn't want to believe in freedom of information, but that's their own ideological radicalism, wanting to deny a documentary record if it's unpalatable to their ideology.
Right.
And that's true on the very both. Far left and also true on the very far right.
Absolutely, absolutely. So even with the anonymous letter was COINTELPRO. Who wrote it was a lie, but the audio presumably was not.
Right. Right.
And came from this hotel incident we spoke of earlier.
Yep.
So anyway, I just know that's where some will aim, right, to try to say, how do we really know, or spread enough doubt, because they're still wanting the pristine public image.
Yeah, I think, it's been very striking to me in all the reaction to Jonathan Ives' book, coming out in 2024. And John's book is, in many respects, more detailed than Bearing the Cross was about all of this. It was very striking to me that John encountered virtually no pushback or denialism, and that people, and I think Black America in particular, is now comfortable enough with the recognized value of King's public legacy, that they're no longer as nervous about his public role being impeached by the private life misconduct, as was the case back in 1986.
Right. Let's talk about that for a minute. For those who, and there will be some who do this, right? They will latch onto this private misconduct to discredit, right?
Now, you've not mentioned this, and this may not be something you've read up on because it's no longer widely remembered. When the King Papers Project was first getting up to speed in the late 1980s, the staff there discovered that the extent of plagiarism in King's PhD dissertation at Boston University, and also in much of his many of his papers for coursework, both at Theological Seminary and BU, that there was lots of plagiarism. Sentence after sentence, paragraph after paragraph. Now, I had read all these things of King's, but I have no background in the theological literature of the 1940s, needless to say. In order to recognize plagiarism, you need to know very well the older works from which the plagiarism is stealing. I've had that experience twice in my own life. Back the year I was at Princeton, 79-80, when I was still reading all the literature on King, I was reading all of these history journal articles on King in chronological order. So I'd read one from 1969, and then I come to one from 1971, and I realized the article from 1971, Journal of Negro History, plagiarizes paragraph after paragraph from an earlier article in a journal called American Quarterly. And I went to one of the more senior historians there at the Institute for Advanced Study and said, and he says, well, write to the editor of the victimized journal. So I did. And in later years, I saw another instance where somebody was plagiarizing from well-known literature. But you have to know literature. So when the King Papers Project staff is going back through all this stuff, they discover things that the rest of us had not. And there was the staff was hesitant how Mrs. King would react when she was told, hey, there's a problem here, a big problem here. I remember being at that meeting. I picture where we were sitting. And again, like we touched on earlier, does Mrs. King really grasp? Does she really grasp this? Does she understand it? It was unclear. So when the King Papers Project proceeds, all this is put out there. So back then in the early 90s, I remember where the Wall Street Journal first went public with this. I remember that day because I was flying back from Bates College in Maine to where I was living in West Harlem. So when that story first broke, that was a big deal, and there was an amount of public debate about to what extent does this offense really undercut or destroy King's historical reputation. Now, there's another literature about King's preaching, which has been first and foremost developed by my wonderful friend Keith Miller, Voice of Deliverance. Keith is himself a PK, preacher's kid. Keith's a white boy slightly older than me. But having grown up in a Southern Texas church household, Keith knew from childhood that there's no such thing as an original sermon. And so Keith, starting in the late 80s, and then in this wonderful book, Voice of Deliverance, Keith lays out the extent to which King, as a preacher, is relying upon, as other preachers have, this decades-old archive of preaching materials that everyone takes from, shapes, reshapes, uses. Now, King took that same form and did it in an academic context where that's forbidden. Now, the folks at Boston University who were King's faculty advisors, who did know the theological literature of the 1940s, should have seen this if they were actually reading what they were signing off on. Now, did they not do their work? Did they knowingly just let it go because he's a black guy? That suggestion was made back in the early 90s. There's no certain answer to exactly why that was let go. So even though that whole plagiarism thing has largely receded into the mists of memory, only recalled by, folks of my generation, I think we've seen that same thing happen, particularly this last 5 or 6 years, with the sexual material. Because as I touched upon earlier, the fact that John's biography drew no flack or complaint whatsoever is, to me, sort of proof positive that too has been sort of put to bed. Now, come 2027, there's another issue that's going to appear, which we don't yet, which I've never had to address publicly because we don't have the relevant transcripts out there. Now, I can remember, fall of '79, first time this was said to me by a former aide to President Kennedy. And he knew because he'd read documents that were sent to President Kennedy saying Well, back in 1965, or even in 1979, would have been a big problem. Now, nowadays, or in 2027, is not a problem. But and the FBI's perception of is rooted in its literalism. It's rooted in Parishioner and Henry Harrington. And let me just say that lacking on any understanding of black male humor, or what most African Americans would call the dozens, yo mama, with the FBI being culturally clueless, they're gonna process a conversation as being literal rather than being humorous and teasing. So this is what, if I'm still alive in 2 years, this is what we'll have to walk through in 2027. But it's gonna be relatively easy then.
You point out in your book that King insisted on the term Christian being added to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and that often even some scholars will overlook the obvious, the context of the church in which he grew up in, and his commitment to the Christian religion. Where does this begin? Take us through what being raised in this looked like, both the beliefs and the practices, and how this shapes King.
The sort of drawing up organizationally for what becomes SCLC was done by Stan Levison, Bayard Rustin, and Miss Baker, Ella Jo Baker, none of whom were religious people. So to me, it's no surprise that Stan and Bayard and Miss Baker wouldn't think to insert Christian into, Southern Leadership Conference. But they're all from New York. But all the folks in the South, King, Ralph Abernathy, Fred Shuttlesworth, Joe Lowry, virtually everybody from the South who actually makes up SCLC in 57, 58 are from Black church congregations. And SCLC was not a individual membership, mass membership group. It was a group of congregations, which is, it's the same sort of, it's the same organizing model that the Alinsky type folks, Gamaliel, had for the groups that Barack Obama started working for in Chicago in 1985 to 88. Same basic, congregation-based organizing. Now, King, grew up in not just the church, but in his family's church. His dad was the pastor. Before that, his mother's father had been the pastor of that church. Daddy King was not educated to the degree that his son was, with, a divinity degree, a PhD. But Daddy King had done a superb job of building that congregation. And it was not a rich folks congregation. Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, was a varied. It was, some were working class, some were professionals, but it was not as upper crust a church as Dexter Avenue, the church that King goes to Montgomery to preach at. Dexter Avenue was the church of faculty members at Alabama State College, the then segregated black school in Montgomery. King grows up experiencing religion as being, this sort of natural, embracing presence in life. He doesn't, even when he decides after college that he is going to be a minister and comes north to Crozer Seminary, where it then was outside of Philly, this is an intellectual attachment to him. It's not really yet an emotional experience. Same thing in his years when he's in grad school at Boston. He wants to be a well-educated intellectual pastor. And he's very consciously distinguishing himself from his dad in all those ways. Now, when the bus boycott begins in Montgomery in December 56, and he gets drafted as the primary leader because he's the new guy in town. He's hardly been there 15 months. And so he's not allied with any of the long-term factions in the black community, which have very clear sort of class demarcations of the faculty folks and working class people like Mr. Nixon, whom we touched on much earlier. But as he becomes the target of death threats, telephone death threats, in the early weeks of the bus boycott, he has what Jim Cohn and I in the early 1980s began to refer to as the vision in the kitchen. King used that phrase once himself, where King sitting there, and I actually stayed in that house, 309 South Jackson in Montgomery, for 3 days or so in, I believe, 85 when there was no pastor at the church, and they let me stay there. So I've been in that kitchen. So again, it was a very humble house. I mean, it's been restored for, historical purposes now, but it was not a fancy place. So King there, sitting there, middle of the night, after the latest threatening phone call, King there has a religious experience of feeling that God is speaking to him and telling him that this is a role and this is a sacrifice and this is an obligation to which he is required to give of himself. Now, that's a central piece in Bearing the Cross. It's a central piece in John's book. Jim Cone, James H. Cone, the founder of Black Liberation Theology, Jim and I became very, very close, 82, 83, 84. We were living not far from each other on the west side of Manhattan. Jim was for many years a professor at Union Theological Seminary. Some people like to think of Jim as a radical because he sounds that way in some of his books. But Jim as a personality was a small, meek, someone who didn't take the subway even in the 1980s in New York. He took the bus. But Jim was a wonderful influence and impact on me, and we sort of taught ourselves King together through those years. And then I mentioned earlier Keith Miller, whom I got to know just a little bit after Bearing the Cross came out, and Keith's background growing up in a preaching family. Keith's insights into King are profoundly important. And then I should also mention, much more recently, Patrick Parr's book, The Seminarian, came out a few years ago now, which focuses on King's time in divinity school at Crozer in the late 40s, which is really where King blossoms. As an undergraduate at Morehouse in Atlanta, he's viewed as a playboy. He's not seen as a particularly serious or impressive person. At Crozer, he emerges as the star student, just in the same way that Barack Obama emerges as the star student at Harvard Law School in the late 1980s. But it's in the wake of that vision in the kitchen in Montgomery in January of '56 that King willingly but reluctantly comes to accept this public leadership role, one he had not sought at all, and one he never really enjoyed. So it's really important to stress that unlike 99+% of people who become famous or celebrities, King was never putting himself forward. King did not have any ego need that had to be satisfied by becoming a public figure. And I've said for many, many years now that, to my mind, the greatest irony of the FBI wiretapping is that it's through those wiretaps that we see again and again how humble and self-effacing and self-critical King was when he's talking to Leveson, when he's talking to Bayard Rustin, when he's talking to Clarence Jones. They say, Time Magazine has named you, man, back then, man, not person of the year. And King says something, what's one more award? So unlike many people I've known, King was never like reading his own press clips. And he was always consciously ambivalent about being the symbol of the movement. He realized very well that the strength and success of the Southern Black freedom struggle was because of the courage and commitment of hundreds and hundreds of people who didn't get their names in the paper or on TV. One of the things I'm most proud of in my own scholarly history is arranging for the publication of Joanne Gibson Robinson's memoir of Montgomery, detailing how it was this Black women's group, the Women's Political Council, that really called for and organized the Montgomery bus boycott. That Mrs. Robinson and several of her closest female friends had been politely on the warpath with white officials about how Black passengers were treated on the buses. Maybe the most striking single document I've ever discovered in 50 years of being a historian is a letter that Mrs. Robinson wrote on May 21, 1954, to the mayor of Montgomery saying, if things don't improve, we're going to boycott your buses. Now, I state that date because that's 4 days after May 17, 54, when Brown versus Board of Education came down. So, right there, distilled in that one-page letter, we see the inspirational impact of the Supreme Court ruling in Brown on a local grassroots activist like Mrs. Robinson. Now, since Mrs. Robinson taught at Alabama State, even though she's in that bus boycott leadership early on, she and the other people who are economically vulnerable to retaliation by white employers, because the Black college is controlled by the state government, they step back. And we see this in town after town, county after county. The Black folks who step forward have some degree of economic protection. They're pastors, they work for the railroad, they work for the postal service, they're a doctor, they're a dentist. Their income comes from other Black folks or from outside the South. Mrs. Robinson, Mrs. Burks, Professor Reddick, finally the white folks catch on, and like 2-3 years later, they're all fired. They all have to leave Montgomery. History hadn't discovered Mrs. Robinson until Mills Thornton, a great historian, focused on her and the women's group in an article that appeared in the Alabama Review in 1980. That's what led me to go find her, go meet her in Los Angeles in April of 1984. But King knew all of that. In addition, King always believed it was an accident that he, rather than Ralph Abernathy, rather than Fred Shuttlesworth in Birmingham, gets made into the symbol. Now, King had the advantage over Ralph or Fred. Fred was a tremendously courageous figure. There's a wonderful biography of Fred by Andrew Manis, M-A-N-I-S, came out a number of years ago. But unlike Fred or Ralph, Doc had this northern white education and could sound like someone who had a PhD from a nationally known university. Fred and Ralph were great speakers, great preachers in a Southern Black Baptist context. And they could get at least as good a reaction as King could. But you wouldn't have Fred Shuttlesworth speaking at Riverside Church in New York.
Just so this isn't lost on the listeners, how were Black people being treated on those buses?
It was segregated in a moving way. Black folks had to be at the back. And there was always some seats at the front, white only, even if there were no white people and the bus is crowded. But there were seats in the middle that were fluid, depending upon how many folks are around. That's the specific context in which Mrs. Rosa Parks gets arrested on December 1, 55, because she had already been sitting down. And then more white folks get on, and the driver says, get up and go stand and give the new white folks your seats. And the rule in Montgomery was that a black person could not sit parallel to a white person. So if you've got one extra white person, 4 black people need to get up, 2 on each side. And that was the situation in which Mrs. Parks decided to stay seated. Now, she'd been active in the NAACP for years, so she knew what she was doing. She hadn't pre-planned this, but she'd had enough.
Yeah, and it was my understanding that they couldn't even apply for jobs.
Oh, as bus drivers.
And then they were dehumanized regularly.
Yes, yeah.
In the treatment.
Generally speaking, you had to pay your dime fare at the front of the bus, get off, and then enter through the back door. Now, on some number of occasions, some drivers would not wait and just take off, stealing the dime.
Right. So bringing this together, how does King approach this as a minister that would be different from someone that doesn't have that background? I'm trying to think how do we see the civil rights movement as this kind of religious phenomenon that I think today we're definitely more secular as a society today. Right. We might miss.
No, the movement, right from the very first night, Monday, December 5th, 55 in Montgomery, at Whole Street Baptist Church. From there, right on through Selma in 65, even most of what happens in Mississippi in 66, the Black Southern movement is a church-based movement because the larger black churches are the really only places where hundreds of black people are allowed to gather together. You couldn't hold these meetings at Alabama State College because the president would get in trouble with the white state authorities. This is a sidebar, but with H. Council Trenholm, who was the president of Alabama State then, same thing with Albany State in southwest Georgia when the movement is active there. Black college presidents, public college presidents, were very vulnerable to state authorities punishing their institutions if the black colleges appeared to be supporting the movement. So that plays a role in why churches as meeting places were absolutely essential. Now, you can find a few, you have to look hard, black pastors who were not willing to have the movement meet in their church. And keep in mind, J.B. Stoner and Dynamite Bob Chambliss, churches were getting bombed. Synagogues were getting bombed because most of the people that were anti-black were also anti-Semitic. So it did involve some degree of risk. Even before 16th Street Baptist Church is bombed in September of 63, which is the one I think best known, remembered by people, because of the 4 young black girls that were killed in that bombing. The Klansmen who planted that had intended for it to go off in the middle of the night, but their timer delayed it until 10:30 or 11 in the morning.
And the governor's reaction was, this is a climate that you guys have created, basically blaming.
Oh yeah. Oh, it's like Vladimir Putin blaming Ukraine for being there for him to invade in the present day.
Yeah. I don't want people to miss that with all this biographical detail, just the big picture of the progress we have made. Not that there can't be more. It's just what was taken for granted back then it's unconscionable. And before I bring it back to his theology, I just don't want that to be lost. That as we dive in and some of the theological influences and stuff, I don't want it to get so abstract that we miss the fact that he stepped forward as a brave person, with his life threatened, calls every night, home bombed, for basic recognition of human dignity.
And I should say too, since we haven't touched on this particular thing yet, King always knew from the 50s that sooner or later he was going to be killed. And that he didn't, it's not like he was obsessed by this, he was not, but it was a rational realization that was always there. He realizes that when he first learns of President Kennedy's assassination on 11/22/63, he acknowledges it when some film producer in, I think, 1966, who's like making a movie or thinking about making a movie, asks, typical producer, how does this end? And King says, it ends with me getting killed. And in the very last, it's like the next to last end note in BTC, I quote Andy Young and Dorothy Cotton, maybe Bill Rutherford, saying, and they said all these things, this is all within a month or so of King's murder on April 4th, 68, that they were sort of strangely relieved that he had finally been killed, because they knew better than anyone how much emotional stress and strain he was under, how tired he was, that he'd come to realize that this was a role in which he was trapped, an incredibly demanding role day after day, and that he was trapped until he died.
What would church have been like for him as a kid? I'm trying to think of, King growing up in a pastor's home. What I don't know if there's a good resource on that. I'm trying to think of, obviously, the sermon.
We don't have. I don't think we have any, certainly early, recorded sermons of Daddy King at all. We've just recently, this isn't public yet, learned that a family out in the Philadelphia area actually has 10 seconds or so of film footage showing King on March 9th, 1950 at a Crozer Seminary graduation, the year before his. But he and his then girlfriend, Betty Moitz, they're just passing figures. This is family footage of like their grandfather graduating from seminary, and they realize, oh, that's Martin Luther King. I mean, it's a great lesson that everybody should save their old home movies, because you never know who might have walked into the shot. No, I'd refer people to John Eige's book, because John spends much more time on Dr. King's childhood than I do. But I'm not sure even John would be willing to speculate about what an Ebenezer service was like, say in the earlier mid-1940s, because we weren't there. I don't think we even have church programs for that, any of that.
It's Baptist, so I know. In fact, I think it's Dr. Ike who points out that Coretta was not Baptist. She came from a different kind of theological tradition.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't off the top of my head have anything reliable I can say about Coretta's experience in Marion, Alabama, church-wise as a child. I and I'm not sure John says much about that. I mean, John devotes more attention to Coretta than I do. We've got a good sense of Dexter when King is pastor there, 56 through 59, because there are a number of recorded sermons there. They're recording just the sermons, not the full services. And also from Ebenezer in Atlanta in the mid and late 60s, because most of those are recorded. So we have a very good firsthand understanding of King as a preacher and how interactive those congregations who had at Ebenezer had literally known him his entire life. That there's a lot of call and response, it's more response with members of the congregation taking the initiative. So those and King, as we touched upon much earlier, King could be quite emotional in the pulpit when he was talking about himself. Or for example, the drum major sermon, 2468, where he sort of spontaneously preaches his own obituary service. That used to be, I think, the best known of his sermons. Unfortunately, because of the behavior of the King family, the King children, in wanting to exploit King's intellectual property for financial gain, unfortunately, the sermons are not like all out there on the web as audio, like they should be. I've emphasized for decades now that it is the spoken King, the recorded King, whom folks should focus upon, not the printed King, because in each of King's books, they are produced by committee. Stride Toward Freedom has some passages by Stan Levison or Harris Wofford. Most of Why We Can't Wait about Birmingham was written by a ghostwriter named Al Duckett, who also wrote the autobiography of Jackie Robinson, the baseball player. My friend Keith Miller, voice of Deliverance, said to me quite recently that Dr. King's collected book of sermons, Strength to Love, published in '62, that those sermons had been aggressively edited to essentially de-black them, to make them, more palatable to a white northern book purchasing readership. This is the sort of thing Keith Miller is so superb at. Dr. King's final book, when he's alive, Where Do We Go From Here? That has chunks by Stan Levison too. Some of King's magazine articles were entirely written by Bayard Rustin or Wyatt T. Walker or Andrew Young. It's the same thing with the autobiography of Malcolm X. It's a wholly undependable document, even though millions of people have had it assigned in high school or college. Malcolm, it was created by, Alex Haley, a professional writer, and Malcolm was killed, before he even signed off on it. So Malcolm's autobiography is a much deeper mess than any of the King books.
Wow. That style of preaching, the tone, was that normal in the Black church?
Oh yeah, I mean, King is we touched on this earlier already. Compared to a Ralph Abernathy, a Fred Shuttlesworth, even Joe Lowry, King has a wider repertoire of preaching materials that he could summon up from his memory because of the breadth of his education. And I should say too, King almost always would preach with nothing more than a note card or two of an outline or bullet points. The very few occasions where King is reading a text, a written text, there's one where he gives a speech at the annual convention of like the American Psychological Association, and these are recorded. On these 2 or 3 occasions where King is reading a text from pages, it does not sound like Martin Luther King. And very famously at the March on Washington in, August 28, 63, where Bayard Rustin's rules were that each speaker had to have an advance written text. King had an advanced text, and that was maybe 65, 70%, the first 65% of what becomes I Have a Dream. And the last third is completely spontaneous, and it's not original to that occasion. King had, my wonderful friend Jason Miller in North Carolina a few years ago discovered a recording at a church up in northeastern in Rocky Mount from late 1962, where King gave essentially I Have a Dream, 9 months before the famous version. And then he gives another iteration of it in Detroit, Michigan in June of 63, 2 months before the march. But these are great examples of preaching as King practiced it. Because over the years, he'd give the same sermon multiple times with slight variations. Probably the one he delivered the most was titled 3 Dimensions of a Complete Life. And the point of the sermon, and I think it's, again, I don't know this the way Keith Miller does, I think the form of the sermon comes from a much earlier white preacher named Phillips Brooks. A lot of King comes from a famous white pastor named Harry Emerson Fosdick. But again, I'm not a theologian. Keith really knows this stuff. Jason knows it. I'm not good at it. But the point of this 3 dimensions of a complete life is that the length, this is a great example on which to end. The point of the sermon is how long you live isn't what matters most. It's only one of 3 aspects of your life, because the 2 at least equally important aspects are the breadth of your human experience, and maybe most importantly of all, the depth of your human experience. And so King had this big library in his brain, and he had this whole collection of quotations from, say, the poetry of Langston Hughes. Jason Miller's written extensively about this very, very insightfully, because someone like myself or John we don't know the poetry of Langston Hughes. So if King all of a sudden recites 10 lines that are from a Hughes poem, I'm not going to recognize that. That's why the greatest original insights into King we've had come from these people, from these scholars who come not as historians, but as Keith Miller, Jason Miller, Nasir Gaemi. They come from different traditions that shed new light.
Right. Who were some of the biggest influences on King? You, in your work, you mentioned some that are a little overrated in their influence, some that are underrated. What's the map he's on? Especially, a lot of our audience are more conservative Southern Baptist. And so they're going to want to know, how does he view Scripture, the Trinity? Is Jesus fully God? These types of things.
Oh, I'm not a theologian. And so this is territory where I'm moderately hesitant. The literature on King before Jim Cohn and myself in the mid-'80s viewed King as the product of the course syllabi he took at Crozer and BU. Now, nobody reads this literature anymore. It's not really relevant to anything anymore. But the course syllabi at Crozer and Boston University, to put it very simply but bluntly, did not include any black people. So if you're some philosophy professor back in the 1970s thinking, oh, this King guy must have been most profoundly influenced by what he read in seminary and what he read in his PhD program, then you see him as the product of this inherited sort of white philosophy of religion, personalism, which was the sort of dominant theme at BU in those years. Edgar S. Brightman and Harold DeWolf. But since King had, spent his entire life up through age 2021 in Ebenezer Baptist Church, we now, again, thanks to Jim Cohn, we can see very clearly how what appealed to King from amongst his readings in seminary and grad school were themes that were white ways of articulating things he already believed and knew because of his own upbringing in the black church. Now, this same thing is true, most importantly, with King's embrace of nonviolence. Everyone associates nonviolence with Martin Luther King. And most often, you'll see this, especially in the older literature, that the formative influence on King was Gandhi, that he reads Gandhi. Well, no. King was aware of Gandhi, but nonviolence appeals to King because it's another articulation of a biblical doctrine of love, of loving your enemies. And the essence of nonviolence is loving your enemies or not hating your enemies. Nasir Ghaemi, whom I mentioned earlier, a psychiatrist, Nasir's phrase for this is radical empathy. Now, I think a lot of people are not instinctively really clear on what's empathy. What's the difference between empathy and sympathy? But as Nasir's work really illuminates, radical empathy is just an academic's way of saying a Christian doctrine of love and loving your enemies.
Right. If we were to look for answers to some of those questions, those theological questions, would it make sense to look at his Crozer papers, the papers he wrote at Crozer, to look at the papers he wrote?
I mean, the King Papers Project volumes, which are only up through 1962 now, they are a very good resource for anyone who's, say, an undergraduate or a graduate student, because they're a rich collection of firsthand documents. But as I touched on a few moments ago, I wish that a wide universal population could listen to those sermon recordings, right from Dexter all the way through. And it's a terrible tragedy that those are not as a public service out there, because his spoken voice is much more powerful than the written words on a page. Now, the King family, has fought to control even use of the I Have a Dream recordings. Now, a lot of that has sort of slipped through or bled through, but it's still dicey ground for people to use that beyond what law calls the fair use doctrine, which is a 4-point test that we won't go into here. So the behavior of the King children towards trying to maximize their own personal income off of King's words has done significant harm to the breadth of familiarity the world has or doesn't have with King's own actual preaching.
Right, and this is a very relevant debate among evangelicals right now, because they'll look at, say, a Crozer paper where he says to believe in the divinity of Jesus is harmful and it's readily denied in my mind. And then it becomes a battle of narratives. And if we don't have access to these sermons, it becomes a battle over silence.
Well, certainly in his years at BU, I'm more comfortable addressing this than the Crozer papers. There is no question that in his writings when he's in grad school at Boston, he is composing them with a very conscious eye towards what do my professors want to hear from me. So there is a degree of calculation involved. And I remember the first time I read his dissertation, which interestingly has never been published in book form because it is as boring and bloodless a document as you could imagine. It's whatever, 300, I can't give the exact page count off the top of my head. You can read that entire dissertation and not get one human sense of the author. It's in part about Paul Tillich. Yeah. It's in the other part about a extremely not remembered theologian named Henry Nelson Weeman. But I don't think reading that dissertation will ever give anyone any degree of insight into Martin Luther King Jr., the human being.
Interesting. As we head to a close here, you mention in fact, I think it's in the FBI and MLK book, the transition from reformer to revolutionary in MLK. Now, I know you say you're not a theologian, but that's certainly the types of terms that we Protestants like to use in categorizing the range from the Magisterial Reformation to.
Yeah, let this be my final answer.
Yeah.
King is in the 50s, like most people in the early civil rights movement, very optimistic. The NAACP, in the wake of Brown versus Board in 54, starts using the slogan "Free by 63."
Wow.
And King, I mean, the first mistake King makes in Montgomery when the bus boycott starts is he thinks that the white community, particularly the white clergy in Montgomery, will willingly accept the black community's call for ending segregation once this injustice is pointed out to them. And he is astonished that the most committed segregationists in white Montgomery are not the business owners or the bus company. They want to make a deal. The most committed white segregationists in Montgomery are the white clergymen. Now, jumping forward a little bit, when the 64 Civil Rights Act and the 65 Voting Rights Act get through, the two great legislative achievements of the movement, that seems, by the standards of 1955 or 1956, to be what the movement was seeking, that this is complete victory. But King realizes, certainly by the summer of 65, when the Voting Rights Act takes effect, that just eliminating legal segregation is actually a very incomplete step towards actual black equality. And those two big, powerful statutes do literally nothing to address discrimination and racism in the North. So King, Bayard, everyone in the movement, Bob Moses and SNCC, everyone undergoes a powerful dose of depressing realization in 64, 65 that the depth of this problem of racism in America is much broader and much deeper and is going to last much longer than King or the NAA or Thurgood Marshall had thought was going to be the case in 1954 or 56. Now, that is the context in which King's radicalization takes place from 66 up through 68, and where King starts speaking privately to his SCLC colleagues at these recorded retreats. We've got full transcripts of all this, and where King starts talking about how we need to move towards some sort of democratic socialism, because King is very committed by those last 2 years of his life to an agenda of economic change, not just racial equality, of economic change that points towards a much greater degree of economic equality and equal economic opportunity across American society.
Is this where some of these quotes where he refers to Marx, how they fit in?
He read Marx.
I know he was also critical. He didn't like the materialism.
I don't think Marx is in any way central to understanding King. Not at all.
Sorry to interrupt.
No.
I figured it would fit in the narrative.
No, I would not single out any white thinkers, writers, as being especially central to King's worldview by those final 2 years. He always has a fundamentally Christian biblical grounding. But he is very powerfully, painfully aware in that final 2 years of his life that much more thoroughgoing economic change is needed, yet he is extremely pessimistic about the prospects of that happening. And again, I think that pessimism, which those closest to him, like Dorothy Cotton and Andy Young, realized, I think their understanding of that pessimism and how exhausted he is plays in very centrally to their feelings of relief that his assassination has ended the suffering he was experiencing in his own life.